Schedule and tens of billions of dollars over budget, but oil is now flowing through the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which the federal government bought in 2018.
Now, the new Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is speaking about President Trump's tariffs. Listen to what he just said.
You won't see these shots on television, but they should be the starting point for any serious discussion about the future of North America's energy sector. Because what is happening right now between Canada, the United States, and China is not just a trade war. It is the beginning of a redrawing of the world's energy map. April 2nd, 2025. This day will go down in history as the moment when Canada officially broke its energy dependence on the United States. The very moment when oil began to flow through the expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline, and simultaneously, a new round of geopolitical confrontation began. This time not just for influence, but for energy resources. Can you feel the tension? This is not just another economic report or a press release statistic. It smells of oil, power, and cold calculation. What's at stake? Hundreds of billions of dollars. The United States, which for decades had been the primary buyer of Canadian oil, more than 98% of total exports, suddenly found itself on the verge of losing that monopoly. Why? Because Canada grew tired of being the junior partner. And Washington, with its own hands, pushed Ottawa to search for new allies. When Donald Trump, ahead of his re-election campaign, announced 10% tariffs on Canadian oil and gas, it was perceived in Canada as a stab in the back. But unlike in the past, when such moves caused confusion, this time Ottawa was prepared. And this is where the most interesting part of the story begins. China enters the game, or more precisely the oil refining giant Rangsheng Petrochemical, a company capable of processing 800,000 barrels of oil per day quietly, without much publicity, opens an office in Calgary and signs a multi-year contract with Canada's largest producer, Suncor Energy. Why? Because while the United States is still thinking, China is acting, and doing so masterfully. The signed contract for the supply of 200,000 barrels per month has already marked the beginning of a new oil route to the east, to Chinese ports. And this is only the beginning. According to Bloomberg, the first tankers are already loaded. And Suncor is not the only player. Rangsheng is actively negotiating with Cenovus Energy, CNRL, as well as international companies like BP and Shell. All deals are signed under the FOB model, which gives China the ability to control deliveries, redirecting oil to wherever the prices are higher. This is strategy. This is control. Do you understand what this means? For the first time in decades, oil extracted in Canada is no longer habitually flowing to American refineries. It is forging a new, independent route. To the east, to China, to Japan, to India. Now let's talk scale. TMX, the expanded pipeline, has tripled its capacity to 890,000 barrels per day. In May 2024, after a decade of legal battles, protests, and delays, it was launched into operation. The project, with a total cost of $34 billion, has become a symbol that Canada can, and will, act independently. Canada has invested not only in the pipeline, marine terminal infrastructure on the coast has been modernized, new storage tanks have been built, and environmental and emergency response funds have been reinforced with $1.5 billion. All of this, not just to export oil, but to turn it into a political weapon and an economic lever. But what is Washington doing in the meantime? President Trump, facing rising gasoline prices in the domestic market, with Goldman Sachs forecasting an increase to 80 cents per gallon, begins a political offensive. He accuses Canada of betrayal and China of undermining American energy sovereignty. But the reality is that it was Trump himself who provoked Canada's pivot to the east. While the White House keeps talking about patriotism, Ottawa is counting the money. According to Statistics Canada, in 2023, Canada's energy exports to the United States reached 200 billion Canadian dollars. But the introduction of a 10% tariff could cut producers' profits by 10 billion. It's only logical that Canada is redirecting its exports. China has already increased its imports of Canadian oil by 22% compared to the previous year, 184,000 barrels per day. And that's just based on official customs statistics. Now, let's talk about gas. LNG Canada, a $40 billion project led by Shell and involving pro-China, plans to begin liquefied natural gas exports to Asia by the end of 2025. It is expected to export 14 million tons annually. This opens up not only Pacific routes for Canada, but also Arctic routes to Germany. In a Europe distancing itself from Russian gas, Canada is increasingly seen as a vital source of energy. This isn't just infrastructure, it's a geopolitical battering ram. Even hydropower has joined the game. Hydro-Quebec and Ontario Power Generation exported 42 terawatt-hours of electricity to the United States, enough to power 4 million homes. Canada earns more than $2 billion from this. But in the context of a trade war, that figure may soon become inaccessible to the U.S. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith states directly, "We are gaining energy sovereignty." And her projection, $500 billion in export revenue by 2035, is no longer seen as fantasy, but as strategy. Here's something to think about. Is China playing the long game more wisely than Washington? Despite disputes over Huawei or Canadian canola, neither country has imposed sanctions on oil, and likely won't. This resource is simply too important. Bloomberg emphasizes, oil remains outside political conflicts, for now. So, what are we looking at? The United States is losing its monopoly on Canadian oil. Canada is opening an Asian trade vector. China gains a reliable partner at a time when the Middle East has become unstable. Europe is looking at Canada as an alternative to Russia. This is no longer a question of if. It's a question of when the energy map of North America will be redrawn. Share your thoughts. Is this the beginning of a new era or the final act of an old one?